It's really great to be back at Town Hall, see all you folks. I miss being the scholar in residence already because it's such a great place to work. You wrote 2008, 2012, you were what was the phrase you used? The message overseer. What is that?
Well, every campaign, in a sense, every campaign needs to tell a story. And I don't mean that in a fictitious way. They need to tell the story of who the candidate is, but more importantly, what the campaign is about. And that's always been my role. I've done lots of campaigns over the years, and it's the thing that I really relish, is being able to tell that authentic story about a candidate, a campaign, and why it's important. And that's the role.
You do that publicly, but you're also doing that with the other people in the campaign and the candidate to shape that message.
Yeah, so, I was deeply involved in all the different outlets of message, the ads, and I spent a lot of years as an ad maker, a political ad maker, the speeches, the press strategy, which becomes kind of minute to minute these days because of Twitter and all of those things that have so enriched our democracy.
I want to come back to press strategy because I want to imagine what that's like, but I'm curious about something. You've heard the criticism that especially with the first Obama administration, criticism from the left as well as from the right. What does the Obama administration stand for? What's their message? I remember Jon Stewart railing about it at one point. What was happening?
What was happening was we were a triage unit when we arrived. In mid-December of 2008, after we had won the election, and I talked about this particular meeting, December 16th, it was at the transition headquarters in Chicago. It was the first meeting we ever had with all our economic advisors incoming, and they gave us a readout on where the economy was. And Christy Romer, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, who was an expert on the Great Depression, said, "Mr. President," this is the first time I heard everybody refer to Senator Obama as President Obama. He said, "Mr. President, we're in this very deep recession, and it's going to be probably as severe as anything we've seen since the Great Depression." Larry Summers said, "Trillions of dollars coming out of the economy, millions of jobs going to be lost." Tim Geithner said, "Banking system's locked up and not lending and could collapse." And then to cheer everybody up, Peter Orszag, the incoming budget director, said, "And by the way, this is going to add trillions of dollars to the deficits." And the president-elect said, "Well, I guess it's too late to ask for a recount." So we better figure out what to do. But, Larry in that meeting and others said there's a 1 in 3 chance of a second Great Depression. And that was the reality that we came to when we took office. And so, he was forced to make a series of decisions, each as unpopular as they were necessary. In addition to that, he made the decision to do health care, and we should talk a little about that later. But there was a lot going on. We had 2 wars, raging, and an ongoing terrorist threat. So there was a lot going on. And frankly, in a campaign, you get to pick and choose sort of what you're going to talk about. When you're President of the United States, especially in the midst of a crisis, it's much harder. And I frankly confess, and I was there, I was very much, I work with the speechwriters every day, and I was very much involved and at the core of that messaging task. Very hard to get control of that. And we made some mistakes. I think we had him out there sort of as the announcer of the government on the theory that people were really panicked about the economy. They needed to hear from the president every day, and we probably overused him.
I think, remember that, and you got criticized for that.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. It was one of those rare things we got criticized for.
Yeah. Well, is there a well, what's happening? Because so the media picks up on that and says, "Well, what's your message? What's your message? Why are you telling us all these things?" And yet, it's the country with millions of people, so one would think that we can take in multiple messages
Yeah,
at
but
one
that's not
time.
really true. You know, the media, the media outlet is a very sort of narrow conduit, and it can't process 6 stories at once. And that's one of the ongoing discussions I've had with the president, is that he very much believes what Mario Cuomo said, that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. In other words, once you're elected, you just get down to business and you do everything you need to do, and you don't worry so much about, the lyricism and the messaging, and because, that's the job. But the truth is that you can't entirely divorce yourself from that process. And I think he came to realize that you have to continually tell a larger story about where you want to lead. And when he does that, he does far better.
Do you guys have a tug of war? Do whoever is doing that with him have a tug of war about that?
Yeah, all the time. Because, his thing was, I remember Rahm had a conversation with him, and Rahm Emanuel, who was our chief of staff, and this was right at the beginning of the administration, and the president laid out these goals, healthcare reform. Obviously, we had all these economic challenges, financial reform. He wanted to close Guantanamo. He wanted to do, we had to end the wars. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things, and Rahm said, "Well, which of these, do you want to do first?" And the president, all of them.
Well, was he wrong?
No, I think I admire him because, Steve, I've come to believe that the world of politics kind of divides itself into 2 categories, the first more numerous than the second. The first category is made up of politicians who run for office because they want to be something, and for whom winning elections is the goal. The second is the more smaller and more admirable group of folks who run for office because they want to do something and understand, yeah, give them a hand. Who understand that winning the election is not the most important thing. The day after we passed the health care law, the president said to me, I was a lot happier last night than I was the night I won the election. And I said, really? He said, winning the election is just the semifinals. This is what it's really about. So I admired him because he always, his view is, I have 4 years and maybe 8 to do as much as I can to make a lasting difference for the future. And he wasn't going to subjugate any of these large goals. He wanted to pursue them all.
Just on that healthcare issue?
Yes, yeah.
That was, you write about how you reacted to that passage. Well, how did you react to that passage?
Well, if I can just, let me set the context. I, like all the political people, were really nervous when he decided to do it. We had a long discussion when he decided to take it on. And I didn't need any primer on why we had to take it on, because I have a child with a chronic illness. My daughter, Lauren, started having seizures when she was 7 months old, horrendous thing. And they told us it was probably a febrile, fever-related seizure. And they said she'll be better in a few days. And a month later, we were released. She was still having 10 seizures a day, couldn't control it. And this went on for 19 years. And in the early years, I was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and I was making $38,000, $40,000 a year, and I was paying out my insurance. I had insurance, but it was inadequate and wouldn't cover the things she needed, including her pharmaceuticals, which were key to keeping her, to try and stop these seizures and keep her alive, really. And we almost went bankrupt. So I understood how much this system needed reform. But I also knew that 7 presidents had tried, 7 presidents had failed. I was very fluent in the research, the polling, and so on what the issue was, the challenges of the issue, which were many. And we had this discussion, and he said, if we don't do it in the first 2 years, it's not going to get done. And the system's going to implode. It's, we have near double-digit inflation, burdening governments, businesses, and families, more and more uninsured. He said, we got to take the shot. He said, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years? Or are we supposed to draw down on it to try and get something done? And, I loved him for that, even as I was making the other argument. I always say I always say I like him so much because he listened to me so little. But every time the health care bill looked like it was not going to happen, he was the guy who kept us moving forward. I went into him in the summer of 2009, and I wanted to just let him know we were taking on some water. I wasn't trying to get him to stop, because once he decided, I was in. But I needed him to know, that we were taking on some water. And he said, I get that, but I just came back from Green Bay, and I met a woman, 36 years old, 2 kids, husband. They have insurance, but now she's got stage 4 breast cancer, and she's hit her lifetime caps. And she's worried that she's going to die and leave her family bankrupt. And by now I felt his hand. I'm standing in the Oval Office. I felt his hand kind of gently guiding me out of his office. And as we got to the door, he said, "This isn't the country. That's not the country we believe in. Let's just keep on fighting." And every time we had these discussions, there was one time when some were arguing that he should throw in the towel, and he turned to Phil Shalero, his legislative director, and said, "Phil, what are the chances? What are the odds of us passing this?" And Phil said, "Well, it depends how lucky you feel, Mr. President." And Obama said, "Phil, I'm a black guy named Barack Obama, and I'm President of the United States." He said, "I feel lucky every day." And so he kept us, even when we lost the Massachusetts Senate race, which seemed like the death knell for health reform, Ted Kennedy's seat of all seats to lose, because we had lost our 60th vote in the Senate. We kept on going because he kept us going. So the night that the health care bill passed, we were all in the Roosevelt room, which is the conference room that's adjacent to the Oval Office, and to my office was right next to his office. And as the final votes came in, the president was in there, the vice president, everybody who worked on the issue, everybody was very happy. I got up almost reflexively, and I went into my office and I closed the door, and I broke down and I sobbed. And I didn't even really understand first. I had to think about, why am I so emotional about this? And I realized, I started thinking about what we went through as a family, my family, and that maybe because of what we had done in that moment, that other families wouldn't go through that. And I went and I found him, and I said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you." And he knows my story well, because we've been friends for so long, well before we were working together. And he said, I said, I want to thank you on behalf of all the families who aren't going to go through what my family went through. And he put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Well, that's why we do the work." And that is something I will never, ever forget. In a sense, that's what this book is about, believer. It's not a believer in one person. It's a belief that together we can organize ourselves, and through politics do things that will make this a better country, and do things that will help people now and in the future. And that was clearly something that was true in that case.
But not a perfect bill, as
no,
you well
far
knew.
from a perfect bill.
So what was the, I don't want, well, justify is sort of a loaded phrase, but how did you justify?
How do I live with myself?
No, how did you justify, the trade-offs and the decisions that were made to get to this, this state?
Look, the truth is, if you were to start off and write a law or create a healthcare system, it wouldn't necessarily be the one we have now under this Affordable Care Act. But we had to pass the best bill we could. As I said, 7 presidents had tried. Bill Clinton had huge majorities in 1993 and 4, and couldn't even get a vote in the Congress on a health reform bill because the opposition was so strong. And so the question was, is this an advance forward? Are we laying the groundwork for future reform? And there was no question that was the case. I couldn't move when when my child got sick. I couldn't move to another insurance policy because she had a pre-existing condition now. It didn't cover her pharmaceutical costs. Obviously, the woman in Green Bay faced these lifetime caps, there were so many things in this healthcare system that conspired against people, and that would be addressed by this bill. And when people say, I was in Berkeley last night, and people asked about, well, why couldn't we have a single payer system? We couldn't have a single payer system, or we couldn't have a public option, because we could not pass the bill. There weren't 60 votes in the United States Senate to pass it.
Is that the distillation of how the message you told each other, in a sense? Is this moving us forward?
Yes, well, I mean, there was no doubt, and I have no doubt as I sit here today, and I think there are at least 11 million Americans who have health care today who would agree, and many more, that we're far better off than we were before this law passed. And it was clear to us that we would be. And like any policy, it will be refined over time. But at least we've established the premise that people should have access to affordable health care.
Do you think there's the politics? Do you think there's the politics to roll it back in 2016, 2018?
You know what? I think it's going to be very hard to do that. Even now you hear the Republican rhetoric, and they're more and more, saying we just want to fix it. Yes, people with pre-existing conditions should be able to have coverage, and they understand. I don't think that this law is going to. We have a Supreme Court decision that's going to be significant, and that could be a roadblock. But I think health reform is here to stay. As I said, we've established a premise that people ought to have affordable health care, that you shouldn't be banned from having health care because you're sick, that you shouldn't lose your health care because you're seriously ill. Those premises, I think, are going to be respected, because the American people are going to demand that, and nobody's going to be able to turn that back. And I'm proud of that.
All right, I could spend the whole night on just healthcare, but I won't.
Yeah.
You write about believers, also about your own journey. And were you a believer when you were an 18? What was the belief you had when you were an 18-year-old kid and walked into some small newspaper in Illinois and said, "Yeah, I should be your political columnist"?
Well, that wasn't belief, that was delusion. No, my belief stems back to the believer. The book begins when I was 5 years old, and John F. Kennedy came to my little community in New York. I grew up in New York City. I don't know if anybody's here from New York, but I grew up in a place called Stuyvesant. All right. I noticed you moved. I come from a place called Stuyvesant Town, which was built for returning war veterans, housing development. And John F. Kennedy came there in 1960, October 27th, 1960, and tells you how long ago that was, that a Democrat was actually campaigning for president 10 days before an election in New York City, because New York was a swing state then. Wow. And he had 10 stops that day, and one of them was in Stuyvesant Town. And the woman who took care of me when I was a child, when my mother was at work, was this wonderful African-American woman named Jessie Berry, who had come up from the South, kind of a classic story, no formal education or very little, and a lot of wisdom and a lot of love. Took care of other people's kids so she could take care of her own. And she said she heard he was coming and thought I should go and see this. And she took me and put me on top of a mailbox on 20th Street in New York, which was a big boulevard where I lived, and cars always filled the boulevard, but now it was filled with people. And this very charismatic young man jumped up on this platform, makeshift platform, and started speaking, and his voice was booming off the buildings, and everybody was paying rapt attention, and it seemed all very important to me. And I didn't understand everything he was saying. Obviously, I was 5. But it was, to me, transfixing, and seemed like something I should pay attention to. And after that, I was just, hugely interested in it. By the way, years later, I was able to retrieve from that day on Google, which none of us could have imagined on October 27, 1960. I was at Microsoft earlier, and I said that, and then I realized maybe Google wasn't the thing to raise.
For your message, you should have said
some
Bing.
politician I am.
Yeah.
But I recovered his remarks, and what he said in part was, I'm not running on the presidential platform that says if you elect me, everything will be good. He said, being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with challenge but also hope, and we'll decide on, I think it was November 8th, I'm not sure, which direction we'll take. And in a sense, that's a distillation of what I believe. I think we have the capacity through the decisions we make to steer history, nudge history in a little bit in the right direction. And that's what this process is about, and that's awfully important. You know, the epigram in my book is from Robert F. Kennedy, who said, the future's not a gift, it's an achievement. And that's, to me, you know, really profound.
Well, you went through journalism.
Yeah. See, what happened was I was really interested in politics. I started working, I gave out leaflets for Bobby in 1964 when I was 9. I would say I worked for Bobby and I always assured people I wasn't the strategist.
When he was running for Senate.
When he was running for the Senate. Then the next year, I thought hard about this and I broke with the Democratic Party. Because they had nominated a guy who, at 10, I thought was a hack. And so I went to work through the Liberal Party for a Republican candidate named John Lindsay. Some of you may remember John Lindsay, who, you know, was one of these another guy who had a big vision and understood that that government was an instrument to do positive things. John Lindsay was, you know, a liberal Republican. You must have some sort of Museum of Natural History here, right? I think they have one stuffed there for you people to and then, so I worked on campaigns when I was a kid, and then when it came time to go to college, I chose the University of Chicago. And I chose it for 3 reasons. The first is, it was a great school, I knew that. The second was that it was more than 600 miles from New York, so I knew my parents wouldn't surprise me with a visit. But the third reason, and a really important one, was that Chicago was such an interesting political town, and you know that, you grew up around there. Yeah. Last of the big city machines, still, Richard J. Daley was still alive. They had hosted that very calamitous 1968 convention, and on the south side of Chicago, there was this budding independent black political movement that was interesting. And I went there because I was interested in studying that. And at the University of Chicago at that time, what I discovered was it was hard to find anybody who wanted to talk about anything that happened after the year 1800. So in order to sate my interest in politics, I started writing for newspapers, which was another passion of mine. My mother had been a newspaper reporter, and I went back to New York for a summer, and I knocked on about 75 doors begging for a chance, and some newspaper that was really down on its luck, the Villager newspaper in Greenwich Village, gave me a job. And for $50 a week, they said, you can do everything, and I covered everything that happened, including politics. And I went back to Chicago with my clips from there, and I walked into this newspaper, the Hyde Park Herald, and I was 19, and the guy said, the guy who ran, a guy named Mervyn Bohannon, said, well, we just lost our political columnist. He graduated from law school, and he's going to work for the Attorney General. You think you could do that? And I said, absolutely, I could do that. And we talked for a while, and he gave me the job. I think it was $25, $15 or $25 a column. And I made myself an expert on Chicago politics. I loved it. I became an expert on the 50 wards and all the colorful characters, different ethnic fiefdoms and the Byzantine history of each ward. And by the time I graduated from college, I was able to parlay that into an internship and then a job at the Chicago Tribune.
What stands out, or who stands out for you from those early years learning the Byzantine politics?
There were so many great characters. I wrote about a couple of guys in my book who were like early mentors of mine. One was a guy named Leon M. Dupre, who was an alderman from Hyde Park, who was the most erudite guy. He was a veteran of sort of the left-wing politics of the 30s. This was around the University of Chicago community, and he was for 20 years he was in the city council, and he was at times the only dissenting voice of 50 to Richard J. Daley and the Machine. He was really courageous. He kind of antagonized his colleagues. At one time he was shot in a street crime and shot in the leg, and they asked this guy Vito Marzullo, who's one of the stalwarts of the Machine, for comment, and all Marzullo said was, "They aimed too low." And Dupre used to quote Shakespeare and stuff to them, which was bewildering. And then there was another guy named Marshall Korshak, who was the ward committeeman, who was the Daley guy in the ward, who came from kind of the Jewish Democratic Machine, and he was a world-weary Machine guy, and he, And then there were all these young characters. I wrote about this guy, Ed Verdoliak, who ended up being a big player as the opponent to Harold Washington a decade later, leading the white opposition to Harold Washington. But he was like an up-and-comer. And Mayor Daley had a stroke in 1974, and the reporters went to, and he disappeared for like 6 months. And the reporters went to Verdoliak and said, "Well, slate making's coming up for the next election. How are you going to choose the candidates?" And he said, "Well, Daley will tell us who we're for, and we'll be for him, just like always." And they said, "Well, Ed, you don't even know if he can speak." And Verdoliak shrugged and said, "He can point, can he?"
What'd you learn from that? What'd you learn about politics from those?
First of all, I think urban politics is the most vital politics there is, because there's no layer between mayors and city council members and their constituents, and they're dealing with quality of life issues that are really significant, including life and death issues, crime and safety, schools, parks, refuse collection, and the quality of streets. And so it's really meaningful. And then you have cities. Most cities are, this kind of simmering cauldron of different ethnic and racial groups, and trying to find a way to work and live together. I just found it endlessly fascinating. And in fact, one of the I ended up becoming sort of an expert on urban politics. And when I went into political consulting, I ended up working in many of the big cities in the country on mayor's races, because they were always so fascinating. I also learned a lot about the politics of race that was useful later when I was working for breakthrough candidates, not just Obama, but Deval Patrick in Massachusetts and others.
What was the Harold Washington?
Yes.
Former Chicago mayor, buck the power, buck the system.
He would be among the most interesting.
So what did you do for him?
Well, first, when he first got elected, I was the City Hall bureau chief for the Tribune when he first got elected. It was a phenomenal race. Harold Washington was a fascinating guy because he was a product of the Machine. His father was a precinct captain. He was embraced by the Democratic Machine early. He was a really bright guy, and he went to law school, and they made him a state representative. And then but he was such a free thinker that he always resented being told what to do. So he was constantly rebelling. And he ultimately became the kind of most avid critic of the Democratic Machine, particularly from the perspective of the black community, which he felt had been disrespected by the Machine. And so he ran for mayor in 1983 against the incumbent Jane Byrne and Rich Daley, and there was this primary in which he got almost unanimous support. I guess it wasn't unanimous, but close to, in the black community. And some white liberals, and was able to win a primary, and the unthinkable, Chicago with an African-American mayor, and then barely won a general election against a kind of not all that inspiring Republican, but race took hold. Then I worked for him. I left the paper in 1984, kind of frustrated with where journalism was going, and Paul Simon was running for the U.S. Senate in Illinois, and persuaded me to. I don't know if you guys remember Paul. He was a great guy.
Bow tie.
Yeah, he was kind of the Orville Redenbacher of Illinois politics. He had horn-rimmed glasses and a bow tie. He used to wear you talk about authentic, he used to wear these suits that were like 5 inches too short. And I learned that what happened was one of his constituents died and bequeathed him 6 suits. Paul just never had them altered, you know. But he was a great guy, just an incredibly good guy, you know, crusader for civil rights, political reform, crusader for civil rights from the Southern Illinois, which, as you know, was closer to Little Rock than Chicago. Very courageous guy. So anyway, I left the paper, went to work for him, ended up managing his campaign, which was a kind of bizarre, a couple of months out of the newspaper business, and we defeated Charles Percy, who was a 3-term incumbent, and Paul went on, and that started my career. So Harold called me and asked me to help him on his mayor's race, and I did. And it was, he did it, you know, he was, when Harold became mayor, the aforementioned Ed Verdoliak led a rebellion among the white ethnic aldermen, and, you know, so Chicago was home to gridlock before gridlock was cool. And they really tried to thwart him at every juncture. So then in '87, he was running for re-election, and he had even though Jane Byrne was a terrible mayor, she came back, and because she was white, she was competitive in the primary and was actually leading at points, and we had to beat that back. We won that primary, and I wrote about an exchange I had with Harold that sort of I loved. We were sitting around the day after the election, and he was about to do his post-election press conference because we still had a general election. And Harold said, "What percentage of the white vote did I get?" And someone said, "Well, 21%. But last time you only got 8%, so we're really making progress." And Harold said, "You know, I spent 70% or more of my time in those white neighborhoods. I've tried really hard to be a good mayor for everybody. I think I have. And I got 21% of the white vote, and we're happy about it." And he kind of smiled sadly and said, "Ain't it a bitch to be a black man in the land of the free and the home of the brave?" And he was an incredible guy. You know?
So he said to you also, he said, one of the people fighting him was Burke, Alderman Burke.
Burke and Verdoliak, And he differentiated between the two.
And how did he differentiate?
Well, they were the leaders of the white insurrection in what was called the Council Wars. And I said to him, "You're always attacking Verdoliak, but never Burke. You know, why is that?" He said, "Well, because I think Burke is an honest racist." He said, "I think he was raised that way. I think that's who he is." And in fairness to Ed Burke, he ended up adopting, after Harold died, he adopted an African-American son and has done a splendid job of raising him. And I think Harold would have been touched by that, actually. But he said, but Ed Verdoliak, he said, he's not a racist. I don't think he's a racist. He said he's using race. He's manipulating race. And he said, that I can't excuse.
So does that echo with how Barack Obama is treated by some Republicans and some aspects of the press?
You know, I think I think the segue you just made is a really smart segue, which is just 28 years or whatever on public radio, you learn a few things, huh?
Thank you.
But yes, you know, I never talked about race when I worked for the president, never, because I didn't want to convey the sense that we were suggesting that all the opposition was motivated by race. I didn't want to turn him into a victim. But in this book, and since I've been out talking about this book, you know, I have to acknowledge that, you know, of course that's been a factor in this, and you know, no other president has had his citizenship question. No other president has had someone stand up in the House of Representatives and shout, "You lie," during a presidential debate. Of course race is a factor, but the interesting thing is, do I think that all of the opponents to him in government and politics are racist? No. Do I think that a lot of them have manipulated race? Yes. I think that, you know, when that guy stood up from South Carolina and said, "You lie," he knew he wasn't hurting himself with his constituents in his mostly white district in South Carolina.
Well, when Mitch McConnell says we're going to oppose everything that Barack Obama is going to do, when you hear that, do you think, how do you strategize against that, knowing that they are able to tap into a part of America that is that responds.
Well, look, what happened in 2009 was this. We won a great victory making the case for bipartisan cooperation, making the case that we needed to get past gridlock and deal with some of the big challenges facing the country. But at the end of that campaign, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The economy almost collapsed, as I talked about before. And it was clear we were going to face this huge crisis. We perhaps naively thought that we might get bipartisan cooperation to deal with that crisis. But they made a different calculation. That calculation was this. They knew that we were going to have to make a series of very unpopular decisions, the Recovery Act, standing up the financial system, intervening to save the auto industry, which seems like a no-brainer now, but was really unpopular then. They knew we had these huge majorities, and their calculation was, we're going to let him contend with these problems on his own. And we're going to make him live with those decisions, and the economy is not going to get better very quickly. And we're going to be in a much better position in 2010. Now, there's no doubt that there were a base of people, and you saw them even in the run-up to the election. Some of those rallies, those McCain, particularly Palin rallies leading up, you saw some of what became the kind of angry edge of opposition, and it was tinged with this sort of nativist rage. But I honestly, when I think about McConnell, who I think is probably one of the shrewdest politicians on the Hill, I think what they did, in terms.
Yertle the turtle. He's that shrewd.
No. I understand that it's hard to understand how a guy talks without opening his mouth. I get that, but no, he's a very, he's a very shrewd political tactician and strategist, and he made a very cold-blooded judgment. I don't think it was an admirable judgment. I don't think that in the midst of a national crisis, it was the right judgment to make. But from a political standpoint, certainly in the short term, they were rewarded for it.
Well, why did you guys continue to pursue and talk about bipartisan cooperation? Was that a calculation?
Because Steve, we ran on the proposition that we should try, and it would have been a disavowal of everything that we ran on to say, hey, now that we're here, we're not going to try and find any governing partners on the other side. We're going to assume the worst from the beginning. And it would have been, obviously they gave us a lot of provocation. But even on healthcare, which was such a big piece of business and a big piece of social legislation, we waited 6 months. We could have moved the bill much sooner, but we waited 6 months because Max Baucus, who was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, said he felt he could get bipartisan support for the bill. And the president met with a number of Republicans, some of whom had supported a similar approach in the 90s, and they acknowledged that much of what was in that bill is in this bill, but said, we unless you get 10 other Republicans, we can't stand with you. I mean, even in the fall of 2009, months into this wait, we thought Olympia Snowe might come along. She had expressed some interest. She wanted some changes. The president said the changes were fine. He said, we can call it the Snowe bill. I don't care. He said, hell, she can move into the White House. He said, Michelle and I, we can move into an apartment. I mean, he really wanted to make it a bipartisan bill, and I think he was keeping faith with the campaign that he raised.
How does that feel now? I mean, because
that he waged, I should say.
Yeah. Well, so now we're in the the last couple of years. He has set a slightly different tone. Right?
Yeah.
He's staking out. His
Well,
own
one of the diabolical things that about what McConnell did was not only did he deprive the president of bipartisan support, but he forced the president to act as a partisan. I mean, the only way we could get anything done was to work with Democrats to get them done. And that gave them the chance to say, he said he was going to govern in a nonpartisan way, and now he's governing as a partisan. But the truth is that the more that got sort of institutionalized, that the more truthful that became. We couldn't rely on Republicans to support us. And they then became also a bit of a captive of their own base, because they stoked this stuff up. And now you see, John Boehner, who, basically gets oftentimes led around by the most strident voices in his own caucus.
But you, as a strategist and as somebody who advises politicians, you understand that this is the chess game you play.
Yes.
And you are not adverse to playing that chess game
Right.
either. What sets you apart in your own personal heart from what they're doing?
Well, I think what sets me and more importantly the president apart was what we were maneuvering to do was pass laws, programs, and policies that would address some of the great problems facing this country, and what they were trying to do was win an election. That's what separates us.
I want to read some of these because you folks wrote them better than me. How often do you think politicians, including Obama, do or say things that they really want to say and not doing or saying for votes in the next election? And wrap your answer around the way you folks prepared for the second debate with Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
Which, after the first one, it seemed like the president was tired, lecturing us, didn't understand what he was saying, and then...
It was not a good night. Well, I wrote about that. I wrote, extensively about the debates. There are two separate questions here. I think that some politicians speak freely more than others. Okay, and I think the president is on the top, upper end of that scale in terms of speaking his mind, and he gets flayed for it sometimes. But let's talk about the debate because October 4th was a date that we had circled on the calendar months and months and months in advance, because the history of presidential debates is that incumbents do very poorly in the first debate, and there's good reason for it. They haven't debated in 4 years. They've been up on this pedestal, and now there's someone sitting right next to them and treated with equal status, accorded equal status, who's like poking and prodding them, and they tend not to react well to that, become defensive. And we wanted to try and avoid that, and we prepped for months. John Kerry played Mitt Romney, affecting a kind of patrician air. And
we're all taking a few moments to let that sink in, though, I got to tell you.
The prep didn't go well. It didn't go well. The president often lit into Romney, Kerry, as Romney prodded him. The president took the bait often, was very defensive, or very offensive in ways that were, uncomfortable and would be if he did it on TV. So, partly what happened in the first debate, and he only read the book after it was in print because I didn't want to give him editorial license over what was in it. But when he read it, one of the things he said was, you should tell folks that you were one of the people who told me not to engage too much in the first debate. And that is true, because the exchanges with Kerry were so caustic that I was nervous that he was going to do that. But more than anything, he resisted what the reality of debates are, presidential debates. And I know this isn't going to surprise many people here, but they are not sort of free-flowing exchanges of ideas, okay? They are very highly choreographed, kind of parallel performances. And when you're ready for a debate, a presidential debate, you've worked through how you're going to answer questions, and you have a pretty good sense of what the questions are going to be, and you've worked through how you want to take those questions, how you want to use it to advance your message, what points you want to make and how you want to make them. That's how you prepare for a debate. We weren't there the night before that debate, and we didn't go through the rigors that we were required because he was resistant to it, the kind of going over lines and preparing. He resisted the artifice of it, frankly. And, the night before the debate, I wrote about an exchange I had, because the last run-through was not good, and we were all kind of worried, and my colleagues generously nominated me to talk to the president about this. And so I did, and he said, well, I think that was pretty good. What do you think? And so I had to make a quick decision as to whether to be honest or whether to be prudent. And I chose honesty. And I told him, no, I don't think it was very good, and this is why, and this is what we... And he got very angry, and he said something to me, and he called me a name that I'd never heard before or since, that I couldn't say, even though this building's no longer a church. I would feel wrong saying it here. And he, but I knew that he wasn't mad at me, he was mad at the fact that he knew that he wasn't ready. And when we got to the locker room in Denver the next day, David Plouffe and I went in to give him kind of an attaboy before the debate, and he just waved us off and said, let's just get this over with and get out of here. And, which is not, these are not the words you want to hear before a presidential debate.
But you found some language, and again, message distillation, you found some language that helped him in the second debate, right?
Well, what happened was, he left the debate stage as a matter of fact, after the first debate. And you can't tell when you're up there exactly what's going on. And he got off, said to his photographer, Pete Souza, well, I think that was pretty solid. What do you think? And he got into, and he went. And I had to go into the spin room, which is this sort of ridiculous tradition where you go in and tell a throng of reporters what they just saw. And it's really hard when what they saw is completely different than what you're trying to persuade them they saw. And so I got pretty much beaten to a pulp and went back to the car to go to the hotel, and I got a call from the president, and he was looking at his iPad as he does, and he said, well, it looks like the consensus is we didn't have a very good night. And I said, I'm still sort of trying to regain my breath from I said, that appears to be the consensus. And, but we had these very tense couple of weeks before the second debate because we knew, the first debate we handled in terms of, our standing really didn't take that much of a hit. There was like all this, in the public polls, there was all this turmoil. But in our own polling, we lost a few points, but we had a few points to lose, and we're still 4 points ahead. But a second debate would have caused great concern, and a second bad debate. And he was rehearsing, he was practicing well in spots, but then 36 hours before, he just kind of backslid. Kerry got more aggressive again, and once again he took the bait, and we really panicked. I mean, and we had this meeting late into the night. We decided we basically had to have an intervention. And the next morning he came down and, because we were sequestered as we always did before debates, in like a debate camp, boot camp. So he comes in, and 4 of us sat down with him, David Plouffe and Jack Lew, his chief of staff, and Ron Klain, who was leading the debate prep. And, we all talked, and I told him, you're treating this like it's a discussion, like it's joint press conferences. I said, this is a performance, and we just got to nail our lines here and know what we're going to say. And you got to say it the same way every time. We can't improvise, like you've been improvising. And he was very candid he said, I know I'm not getting this. I understand. He said, I was trained as a lawyer, and I'm treating it like we're trying fact here, and I know that's not what this is. And he said, but I'm just kind of screwed up right now. He said, he mentioned the movie Tin Cup, and he said where Kevin Costner's golf game was off kilter, and he was slicing the ball, and Cheech was his caddy. And Cheech said, okay, here's what you do. You tip your cap this way, and you do this and that, and you put your tees in your left pocket, and you'll be fine. And Kevin Costner does all those things, and he swings, and the ball goes straight and true. And he said, it's in my head, and we actually gave him a golf tee to put in his pocket before the next debate. We honestly did, and he went out there with it. But after we broke up, he said to me, this is a guy who's incredibly self-confident, And before the first debate in 2008, I asked him how he was feeling, and he said, just give me the ball. I mean, that's the guy I know. So it was really unusual for him to be, facing doubt. And he said that. He said, it's an uncomfortable feeling for me. I'm not used to this. But he went off for an hour, and he came back, and he came back a different guy, and we went through each answer again and again. He would work with the lines, he'd change them, he'd improve them, he'd have ideas, but he locked them in. And the next day he came down, we were going to leave for New York for the debate, and he had diagrammed 14 answers exactly the way he was going to do them. And when we got to the locker room in New York, he said, called Pluff and me in again, and said, I just want you guys to know we're going to have a good night. And we did. As soon as he answered the first question, we knew we were going to have a good night, because everyone in our room, when we had a little watching room underneath the arena, everyone in our room knew we could have mouthed the words he was going to speak. We knew what he was going to say, and that was true throughout.
I'm going to ask a big question about that here, if I may, and reject it or not.
Okay.
Why is American politics a performance?
Well, it was Franklin Roosevelt who told Orson Welles that Roosevelt, was the second greatest actor in America. Okay, this is not new, because part of this job is to move people, and that's not to say that it should be artifice. For a lot of politicians, it is, and there's no doubt about it that, George Burns once said, all you need to succeed in show business is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you've got it made. And a lot of folks in politics live by that maxim, and they try and say what they think people want to hear. That's not what this was about. This was about taking our message and distilling it, our positive message, our critique of Romney, and where we thought and how Obama wanted to lead the country, what the race was about. It goes back to your initial question about what messaging is. And we wanted to take each question and make sure that it had those components, so that when people left the debate, because some people weren't paying attention to the president, they're not watching and consuming every word. These debates were windows for many people who hadn't been watching. So we wanted them to leave with a clear sense of what the race was about, what the distinctions were about. And to do that, you need to be prepared and maximize your time and use those answers to the greatest possible effect. And that's the way it's always been. I detect a hint of skepticism in your question.
Actually not. It's about.
Well, maybe I detect a hint of defensiveness in my answer.
Yeah.
I knew one of us was up to something.
I just think it is that and I think it's good that you mentioned Roosevelt, right? The first radio president. I mean, it is about
Still has fans.
It is something about the importance of a leader being someone we will follow.
Yes.
I guess that's obvious, but it is something about that, isn't it?
And that's it's an important part of the job.
Jimmy Stewart has a certain effect on us, as opposed to, I don't know who I would mention that would be improper, but
Right.
There are certain actors
the people
that fill
you
that
wouldn't
same
mention
role.
probably have never made movies we would remember.
Right, exactly.
But there is an element of this, and look, Lincoln was a great performer. Teddy Roosevelt was a great performer. Right. All our great presidents were gifted in that way.
And did you know that about politics going into it as you got?
Well, I was drawn. Look, my first experience was John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
I was drawn to that, and I loved the performance of politics, and I never thought that it didn't have meaning, but I loved that the bigness of it, and and responded to it. So, I always knew that. The thing that you have to fight when there were times in my career when I became disillusioned by the cynical calculations involved in campaigns, and because we have all this technology to tell us what people think, and it's easy to say to a candidate, okay, this is what people want to hear, so say it. You know, it's easy to do that, but you know, it's not very satisfying. And you know, my partnership with Obama began in part because I was at one of those existential moments when I was wondering whether I wanted to stay in politics. He was also at an existential moment because he lost a campaign for Congress in 2000 and was, you know, considering whether to continue politics. He lost the race, you know, narrowly by 30 points. And so he was not in, you know, great political shape. My existential crisis was that I had a client in the 90s who I helped get elected to Congress. And some of you may be familiar with his name, Rod Blagojevich, which I've been on the road for several weeks. Stephen, I have to tell you, it engenders the same response every time. Mention of his name. But he came to me in 2001 and said he wanted to run for governor, and I was sort of appalled by that. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, well, if you need me to help you figure it out, you shouldn't run. You know, that's not what I do. If you tell me why you want to run, I can help convey that to people. But he ran anyway without me, and he hired a very good firm out of Washington, and they did a state-of-the-art campaign, you know, and he went out there. The previous governor was also on his way to prison, George Ryan. So
yeah, you guys have had a good run.
No, I know. Well, you're a native, so you understand. But I mean, and I'm not the greatest picture of the land of Lincoln, but so he ran as a reformer, Rod Blagojevich, and he also ran on a no-tax pledge in a state that was clearly had fiscal challenges, which bothered me. But I knew by the summer of 2002, I knew he was going to win. Jim Ryan was the Attorney General, not related to George. Very admirable, conservative guy. I didn't agree with him on stuff, but a good guy. But he was like, I mean, it was like watching Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. Rod was just running circles around him. And he was going to win. And I thought, geez, you know, maybe I should rethink, maybe it's time to move on to something else, because if this is the level of cynicism this requires, I'm not sure I want to do this. And Barack Obama called me at that time and said, I'm thinking of running for the U.S. Senate, and I'd like to talk to you about it. And there were other candidates running who were better known and better funded. He had just lost this race. His name was Barack Obama 1 year after a guy with a similar sounding name had visited havoc on the U.S. He was a black guy from the south side of Chicago with not a lot with no roots around the rest of the state and so on. And so there were a lot of reasons to think it was a quixotic effort. But I told my wife, Susan, if I could help Barack get elected to the Senate, that would recharge my batteries. That would help, you know, that would recharge my idealism. And that's how we got paired up.
I'm going to give you 3 questions that you'll have to answer sort of quickly, but this sort of flows right into this. Convince me, 30 to 40-year-old female, obviously I'm reading this.
I'm quickly scanning the audience trying to guess whose question this is.
That corruption hasn't ruined what the founders started.
Well, let me say that I don't think corruption is new in American history. You know, we lived through a period in the late 1800s during the Gilded Age when not unlike some of what we're seeing today, it was a time of great, it was the Industrial Revolution, great technological advances that created the ability for the development of great concentrations of wealth. We had oligarchs, those oligarchs, the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and others, really dominated our politics with their money and dominated public policy with their money. And that gave rise to the progressive era and Teddy Roosevelt. And we self-corrected. So I have concerns, you know, about the new Gilded Age and the great concentrations of wealth and the power that, particularly given the Supreme Court ruling on Citizens United, that the new oligarchs have in influencing our politics. And they're not all limited to one side, but they're mostly on one side. I understand the root of the question, but I've also seen in these last 6 years some extraordinary things happen that represent progress in our country. So even on the sloppy track, because so many people got together in 2008, and I suspect many people in this room, and elected a guy who nobody thought could get elected at the beginning, and because he persevered, we had 180,000 troops overseas when he got elected, and now there are 15 in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. We got through the financial crisis, and as I mentioned, part of that was also the fate of the American auto industry was at stake, and I saw the president make really courageous decisions, and that one in particular, I remember, and I wrote about that in this book. The way that decision came down, and the politics were not good of making that. And he said, look, there are 1 million jobs we're going to lose if the auto industry goes down, and so I'm willing to take that risk. And we've seen tremendous advances in the way gay and lesbian Americans are treated. Don't ask, don't tell is now a thing of the past. DOMA, gay marriage, I think is we have the last gasp. The Supreme Court's going to rule, and so on. But I think that you don't even hear Republican candidates talking about it anymore. It's done. We have financial reform, imperfect, but far better than what we had before. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the one that Elizabeth Warren fought so hard for so long. So even on this sloppy track, real progress came because people organized and got together and decided they were going to try and change the direction of the country. And we shouldn't minimize the gains that have been made. I think they're historic. And by the same token, slightly off point, but on the larger point, I think back to 2000 and that election, and by a margin of, and we can quibble about what the actual count was and so on, but by a margin of 527 votes in the state of Florida, George Bush became president of the United States, which means that if 528 people had woken up that day and said, I think I'm going to go and take a few minutes and vote for Al Gore, or if 528 people said, I really like Ralph Nader, but I don't think he's going to be the president, and this is pretty important, and I'm going to vote for Al Gore. Think how different history would have been. We almost certainly wouldn't have gone into Iraq, which was an absurd decision. There was nothing, and I'm sure I'll light up Twitter for having said that, but it's pretty hard to argue, I think.
What, that it's an absurd decision?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think you'll light up Twitter for saying that.
Well, not in this room. I got to tell you, Steve, not everybody is represented in this room,
no,
I suspect.
I understand.
But we would have been way down the road on climate change because he was so committed to it, and we almost certainly wouldn't have squandered a $2 trillion projected surplus on tax cuts, most of which went to people who weren't asking for them and didn't even need them. So this stuff matters. Yeah. And so for the 30 to 40-year-old woman who's disillusioned, please stay engaged, because it's so important that we do.
All right. That is a lovely and fine ending. However, I'm going to ask 2 more addendum questions. Why is the Obama, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, why is the Obama administration so focused on cracking down on leaks and getting reporters to, reporters and people in the administration to not leak, to toe the line? It feels like they're afraid of truth coming out.
No, first of all, I come out of a journalism background. I revere journalism. I don't revere sometimes people who call themselves journalists but don't practice journalism the way it's supposed to be practiced. But I do understand very clearly, I used to be an investigative reporter, that it is the job of journalists to shine bright lights in dark corners. And, but at the same time, when you're the President of the United States and you're charged with the safety and security of people, and you every morning are briefed on real, honest-to-God terrorist threats, and you've got operations all over the world, Americans trying to thwart those threats, and there are leaks that put those people at jeopardy and maybe put the operations in jeopardy to the point where people are going to lose their lives. You have to find the balance between the two. But I'm uncomfortable with the notion of jailing reporters, prosecuting reporters, and I'm heartened by the fact that that Mr. Risen isn't going to be prosecuted, and that Attorney General Holder, on his way out, has promulgated much more, I think, thoughtful regs as relates to the issue of how reporters are going to be dealt with, because I think this is we have to keep people safe, and we have to also preserve those ideals that make America unique, in many ways.
You are a businessman, so you have been hired to go work.
That was, even when I ran a business, nobody would take that seriously. But
well, the Labour Party,
especially my partners,
the Labour Party in the UK is taking it seriously. You're going to help.
I didn't really take that on as a business proposition.
Well, that was my question.
I took down. I signed on to help the Labour Party and Ed Miliband, who's leading the Labour Party, because I think that the struggle there is very much like the struggle here. The big issue facing their economy is the same as ours. That you see the same things happening: great concentration of wealth, 80% or more of people either just holding ground or falling behind. And I believe that they, as we, need strategies to deal with that.
Jim Messina, right, is going to work with David.
Jim's a good businessman.
Yeah. Well, you have classed with him. You've worked with him.
No, Jim's a friend of mine. He was the campaign manager in 2012 of our campaign. He was sort of an underling to David Plouffe in the 2008 campaign. And I wrote in the book about a moment when Jim and I wept together when the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act, because we had both worked really hard on it. So I consider him a friend, and I'm not going to speak for him as to why he would be on the other side of this. That's for him to...
No, but you have a strategy, and now you know the guy on the other side. What are you thinking?
Well, what am I thinking about why he's there?
No, what do you think about what you're going to do for Ed Miliband?
Well, I mean, I think what the challenging thing about British politics is that it may be refreshing as well, but there are no ads. There's no paid media. You guys can give a hand to that, I'm sure. But you basically, and there's a short campaign, and you basically have to communicate through the earned media, newspapers and television and so on. And the press in Britain is really interesting, because they all bring their point of view, not just to their editorial pages, but to their coverage. So it's a very dirty filter that you're trying to communicate through. So it's difficult. But I really believe that most people in Britain, as most people in America, want an economy where if you work hard, you can get ahead, where kids can get the education and training they need to make the most of their lives and do it without being burdened with extraordinary debt as they begin their lives, that puts an emphasis on the kinds of things that build economies in which prosperity is broadly shared. I think people really want that. They want, as he said, they want a recovery that reaches kitchen tables and not just corporate suites. And so I think that's a worthy fight. And that, I'm at a point in my life where I'm not going to do any more campaigns here in America. And but occasionally a project will come along overseas, or some project that is not an electoral project. And if I think I can do something of value, I'll do it. As you know, my principal occupation right now is that I started this Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, in part to bring what was there, what wasn't there when I was there, a way for students who are interested in the world to interact with practitioners in the public arena, and hopefully to think about careers in the public arena, because kids today, I think, are as public-spirited as any I've seen since the 1960s, but they're very skeptical about whether politics is the way to affect change. You know, most kids today, their first instinct is, well, let's create an app. You know, let's do something through social media. And I got to tell you, that's powerful. Government could learn from that. But there are certain things that require us to act together through government. And I always tell them, you know, Congress is going to meet with you or without you. And they're going to make decisions about all the equities that you care about, whether it's human rights or education or climate change, or you know, if you're someone from the right, you know, the size and scope of government. So whatever it is you care about, whether you like it or not, we're in a democracy and government's going to impact on that. And you either get in there and try and influence things in the right direction, or live with the consequences. And that's sort of I'm kind of a missionary on that message now. And it seems to me that's a worthy way to spend my life at this point.
You still talk?
And who am I going to work for who I could have a better experience with than this guy?
Do you still talk to him?
I do.
On this trip, have you called him up and told him
We've
cool
emailed.
things
I
you've seen?
actually emailed him and told him that I apologized for all those times when he complained about all the events we were adding to his schedule. Because I have just some small feeling for what his life must have been like then. And he sent me back an email saying, "I'm feeling you, brother." But I talk to him from time to time. I really, you know, look, Barack Obama was my friend. You know, I met him in 1992, and we've been friends for a really long time. And in addition to our political partnership, you know, we've had some wonderful discussions about life, about our children, certainly about sports, and you know, we're friends. And I relish that friendship. And you know, he's a busy guy, so I'm not calling him regularly, and he's not calling me regularly. But we talk from time to time, and I relish that.
Last question, who's your favorite professional athlete and why?
My favorite professional athlete and why? That's such a tough question.
Russell Wilson's pretty good. You could go for him.
No, but I will. Let me mention I don't know if Karen Russell is here. She said she was coming, and I don't know if she was able to come. But so let me mention an athlete who lives here in Seattle named Bill Russell. One of the great pleasures I had, and Karen was there in the White House, was when he came to visit the White House, and I got to have lunch with him, and it was such a great experience. And I would say 70% of the conversation had nothing to do with basketball, but Bill Russell used his position as the first African American coach of a major sports franchise, and as as one of the great athletes of all time, to influence the social progress of this country during the civil rights era. He was always outspoken on those issues, and so I admired him for that. That, you know, now we shouldn't necessarily expect that from our athletes. You know, Charles Barkley, who actually is someone I also deeply admire, because he does always speak his mind, said, "We're not heroes. We're athletes. We're good at what we do, but that doesn't, you know, everybody imputes to us all the qualities they'd like us to have." You know, Michael Jordan gave me so much pleasure for 13 years in Chicago. It was, you know, it was such a great, I used to tell my sons, you know, who thought, you know, that two things happened in June. You know, you finished school and you went to the NBA Finals. when Michael Jordan was there, and it was all because of him, the most extraordinary athlete I ever saw. But you know, and not a bad guy, but everybody wanted him to be everything, you know. So you know, and so if you ask me, like, who is an athlete I most admire as an athlete, you know, who I saw on a regular basis, you know, I'd say him, because he was so extraordinary. But if you're asking me who I admire as, you know, a person, you know, that's a larger question. And so Bill Russell is as good as anyone, and the fact that he lives here in Seattle makes it a good answer, too.
Mr. Axelrod will sign some books in a few minutes. Thank you, sir. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.